Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Mark Borstein. I'm the CTO of Tremolo Security and the co-author of Kubernetes and Enterprise Guide, second edition. In this video, we're going to deploy namespace as a service with OpenUnison. Now, in a previous video, linked to here somewhere, I'll know once I publish the video and add the link, we deployed OpenUnison with Kubernetes and Okta, so we could do authentication. But the next step now is we're going to update that to support namespace as a service to begin turning our Kubernetes cluster from a single tenant cluster into a multi-tenant cluster. That's going to give us better utilization of resources. We'll be able to pack more containers in there. It'll also give us better utilization of people resources. People are hard to find. Good help is hard to find. The more clusters you have, the harder it is to fix all of them and have enough people to maintain them. And so what we want to do when we move to namespace as a service is we don't want to have to manually create namespaces and create the objects with it. We want to create a self-service environment. Our admins aren't in the business of creating namespaces or adding users to groups. And so what we're going to do is we're going to deploy OpenUnison's namespace as a service. It just requires a couple updates to the Helm charts and a couple pieces of infrastructure. What that'll give us is a self-service portal where users can log in, request that namespaces get created, and then manage who has access to those namespaces. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to log into our OpenUnison. Actually, I lied. First thing we're going to do is we are going to check out the documentation. So here's the documentation on how to do this, and we're going to do a couple of things. First off, start off here with deploying the NAS portal. We support, you need to have a database. That database handles both audit data and state, and will support MySQL, MariaDB, Postgres, or SQL Server. I've got MariaDB set up with a Unison database and a username password all ready to go. You also need an email server, an SMTP server. That's because when people request access to namespaces, those accesses need to be acted on by approvers, and those approvers need to know that they've got an active approval waiting. And so you need an email server in order to notify them. Now, if you don't have an email server, I don't have an email server just lying around. We created a SMTP black hole container. So emails go in, they don't come out. So it's really helpful for testing when you don't necessarily need to send out notifications. So we've got that deployed as well. And there are instructions on how to do that in the documentation. So we're going to walk through, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to update our secret with the password for our database and the password for our SMTP server. We'll do kube control, edit secret. I've already got it in there. And we're going to add a couple of parameters. So first we're going to add JDBC password. And I know we have a very secret secure. Now remember, if you're using echo-n to encode these on the command line, make sure to do echo-n. Otherwise, you're going to get an extra carriage return in there. And SMTP password. Since I'm using the black hole, it doesn't really matter. I'll go ahead and encode that. Now we're actually going to add one other step here. When we get to the point where we're adding namespaces, we're going to be able to associate those namespaces with groups from Okta. And so as we do that, we don't want to have to type out those names. We want to be able to pick them out of a list. So we're going to enable OpenUnison to talk to the Okta API, list those groups. So I'm going to come over to my Okta panel. And I'm going to go to Security, API, Tokens. And you can see that I had already created one earlier. I'm going to go ahead and revoke that one. Or, oops, yes. So let's go and create a new token. No, I don't want to update my password there. OpenUnison NAS. And let's go ahead and get that. Okta token. And let's encrypt it. or not encrypt it, base64 encode it. Okay, so our token is in there. We're going to use that later on. So now that we've done that, come back to our documentation. The next step is to configure our database. Now, here are the configuration options for the different databases. The default values YAML, it's actually already in here, works with MariaDB. So here it is configured with the MariaDB that's running inside of my cluster. And then also we need to enable SMTP. So I uncommented these lines as well. Again, working with the black hole that's already enabled in my cluster. Yeah, so the next thing we're going to do, even before we do this, I got to rearrange this documentation again, is determine what kind of namespace as a service model we want. OpenUnison supports 3 models. The first is external groups. An external group is where you're going to let something like Okta or Active Directory determine who has access to the namespace. You pick the group or you specify the group depending on your authentication method, and anybody who's a member of that group, once they log in, they get access to that namespace. Another option is to let OpenUnison maintain the groups internally. In this scenario, once the namespace gets deployed, the users can actually log in and request access to that namespace. Or you can go with the hybrid approach where you allow both. You're not locked into either, so if you go with internal initially and then you want to add external or vice versa, works perfectly. The nice thing about the external is it lets you delegate authorization decisions to someone else, namely your centralized identity provider. The nice thing about internal access management is that it makes it easier to manage exceptions. You own that data. That data is inside of your database, so you can change it at any time as the systems owner, which is something you can't do if for instance, you don't have admin access to Okta. So we're going to go with the hybrid model, and we're going to make a couple of changes to our config. So first off, we want to show the portal orgs. That'll become important in a moment. We're going to enable provisioning, and we're going to disable the standard JIT workflow because namespace as a service has its own just-in-time workflow. Then we're going to specify which groups will have access to Kubernetes. The first 2 groups will get created automatically by OpenUnison. These groups are your administrators. You'll have an internal one and an external one. That way you can separate out where the administrators are coming from. So if you need to give someone temporary administrator access without giving them access in Okta, you could add them to the internal group. And then finally, groups that will get generated as namespaces get onboarded. And then the last bit here is we need to configure our actual namespace as a service. So we're going to enable both internal and external groups. With the external group, you have to specify both an administrator group and a cluster admin group. These groups come from Okta. So if I come over here to Okta and I go to directory and I go to groups, you'll see that there is a group called Kate's admins. So any user that's a member of Kate's admins will be able to manage our OpenUnison instance and our cluster. So the next thing we're going to do is we are going to update our orchestra deployment. Now this one's going to take a few minutes because we're not just updating the pod in the configuration, we're actually adding a new component. You'll see here we've got this ActiveMQ pod gang created. OpenUnison and uses ActiveMQ as a message bus. So every workflow that we have, every message goes on the bus. So that way you can scale up OpenUnison. You might have 2 or 3 OpenUnisons for high availability. If for some reason pod can't talk to the API server, it'll retry a request. If you're talking to external systems like directories or databases or APIs and they for some reason aren't available, it'll retry the request. And if it gets to a certain number of failures, it'll move it into a dead letter queue. So we are going to give this a couple of minutes and wait for it to be up and running. All right, so we are back up and running. So next we are going to upgrade our login portal. And there we are. Yep, talking to the right one. This one's a little bit quicker. Excellent. And then finally, we're going to install a new chart, cluster management. So the cluster management chart has all of the workflows, the screens, everything that we need to be able to onboard new namespaces. And that's it. So we're going to go ahead and turn on our logs. So we're keeping track of things. And let's go ahead and log in to, let's make sure that we're not logged in as another user first. All right, let's go ahead and log into our new NAS portal. So I'm going to log in, and you'll notice that we don't have our portal or our dashboard and token badges anymore. That's because they've been moved into local deployment. OpenUnison NAS is built to support multiple clusters. We'll cover that in another video. But now that we have that there, we can still access this cluster no differently than other clusters and get our tokens, get our badges, or get our dashboard access. We also have this OpenUnison management screen that gives us two new badges. The active MQ. So this is where we can go to manage the queues that are open. We can see if there's anything in the dead letter queue. We also get an operators console where we can actually search for users, see what roles they have, and run workflows directly against them. So we'll cover that later. And then finally, this is really the big one, create a new Kubernetes namespace. So this is the form that'll let us create a new namespace. These groups are coming directly out of Okta, so we can, as we type, the correct groups come up, so that way we can search for groups and we can determine if we want to have internal or external. So we're going to stop this video here. OpenUnison has been deployed with NAS, so in our next video, we're going to go ahead and actually create a new namespace and manage access to that namespace. Thanks, and have a great day.